In 1323 BC, a team of royal embalmers in Thebes took a curved bronze rod, shoved it up the left nostril of a 19-year-old named Tutankhamun, and vigorously whisked his brain into a gray, lukewarm slurry. They did not preserve this liquefied tissue in sacred obsidian jars, nor did they offer it to the gods of the underworld. They poured it down a limestone drain, rinsed the empty skull with palm wine, and stuffed the vacant cranial cavity with sawdust, tree resin, and linen rags soaked in asphalt. Subscribe. You will want to see how this cosmic misunderstanding unfolds. For a civilization that calculated the circumference of the Earth, engineered precise stone pyramids that align with constellations, and established sophisticated surgical treatises on spinal trauma, the organ responsible for every piece of music, poetry, and strategic brilliance they ever produced was viewed as nothing more than useless, snot-producing cranial packing material. Modern humans view the brain as the absolute crown jewel of biological evolution, a neurological supercomputer containing 86 billion neurons that generate consciousness, love, calculus, and existential dread. To the ancient Egyptian, however, the brain was merely bodily waste, an awkward lump of fat that turned into toxic sludge 3 hours after your heart stopped beating. If you ask a modern neuroscientist where your identity resides, they will point directly to your prefrontal cortex. If you asked an embalmer in Memphis during the New Kingdom, they would laugh in your face, hand you a bronze hook, and tell you to clear out the head so they could save the only organ that actually mattered, the heart. This massive cultural disconnect exposes the fundamental delusion of human history, the assumption that technological mastery goes hand in hand with accurate biological understanding. The Egyptians built a multi-millennial civilization around a medical system that got the central hardware of human thought completely backward, and yet their anatomical ignorance birthed the most lucrative, obsession-driven mortuary industry the world has ever seen. To understand why a priest would spend hours systematically churning a corpse's cerebral cortex into a milk-like emulsion, you have to look at the brutal, unyielding thermodynamics of the Nile River Valley. When an Egyptian nobleman died in the blistering heat of July, his body did not politely wait for embalmers to perform elaborate 70-day purification rituals. Autolysis set in almost immediately. Cells starved of oxygen broke open, releasing digestive enzymes that began liquefying internal organs from the inside out. Because the human brain is roughly 80% water and densely packed with lipid fats, it quickly became ground zero for microbial decay. Left unmolested inside the skull, the brain would rot into a putrid gas bomb, expanding until it burst through the ocular sockets and ruined the meticulously painted facial features of the deceased. An unmummified face meant the Ka, the spiritual double of the deceased, would not recognize its physical host upon returning to the tomb, effectively condemning the soul to permanent non-existence. The removal of the brain was not driven by medical curiosity or religious reverence. It was emergency sanitation protocol, masquerading as a holy sacrament. The term for this gruesome procedure is excerebration, and it required a level of blind physical force that utterly shatters our romanticized visual image of quiet, incense-filled embalming chambers. The embalmer took a long, square-sectioned bronze spike, positioned it against the ethmoid bone, the paper-thin sheet of bone separating the nasal cavity from the brain case, and hammered it upward using a wooden mallet. Once the bone cracked open, the embalmer plunged a hooked wire deep into the frontal lobes, twisting, scraping, and whipping the neural tissue until the structural integrity of the cerebrum collapsed entirely. Once the brain was completely pulverized, the embalmers turned the body face down over a wooden table and let gravity do the heavy lifting. The gray matter slowly trickled out through the nostrils into a shallow pottery vessel, leaving behind a hollow bone vault. But even then, the job was only half done. Small fragments of brain matter stuck in the crevices of the skull would still rot, So the embalmers poured hot, liquefied tree resin mixed with molten beeswax down the same nasal passage, filling the void and coating the interior bone walls in a sterile, waterproof lacquer. To the modern observer, this brutal destruction of the brain feels like an unfathomable act of vandalism against human intellect. Yet inside the mind of the embalmer, they were simply clearing out dangerous waste to protect the body's true command center, the heart, known as the Ib. To the Egyptians, the heart was the literal engine of human consciousness, memory, and emotion. It was where you formed opinions, fell in love, plotted against your rivals, and stored every secret thought you ever had. When an Egyptian felt their heart race in terror or flutter with desire, they did not attribute it to adrenal glands or neurotransmitters. They took it as direct physical proof that the heart was thinking. The brain, by contrast, had no obvious pulse, produced no visible movement, and sat quietly inside a thick box of bone like a damp, useless sponge. If the brain had any function at all in their medical texts, it was believed to be a fluid cooling radiator or a factory for manufacturing nasal mucus. This total inversion of human anatomy was not a minor oversight. It was the foundational pillar of the entire Egyptian cosmic order. When an individual died, their journey through the underworld, the Duat, did not involve a cognitive test of their intelligence or an evaluation of their memories stored within the brain. It boiled down to a hyper-specific, terrifying physical audit known as the weighing of the heart. In the Hall of Two Truths, before 42 divine judges, the deceased stood while the jackal-headed god Anubis extracted their physical heart and placed it on a golden scale opposite the feather of Maat, the goddess of truth, balance, and cosmic order. If the heart was heavy with sin, deceit, or cruelty, the scales tipped, and a terrifying beast named Ammit, a hybrid of crocodile, lion, and hippopotamus, devoured the organ on the spot. Without a heart, the individual suffered the second death, an eternal oblivion from which there was no resurrection. If the heart was light and balanced perfectly against the feather, the soul passed through into the field of reeds to enjoy eternal paradise. Conspicuously absent from this divine trial was the brain. No god stood over a scale weighing the frontal lobe. No deity cared if you were a brilliant military strategist or an illiterate peasant. Your intellect was irrelevant to the cosmos, but your moral heart was everything. Consequently, leaving the heart inside the chest cavity was a strict, non-negotiable commandment. Embalmers took extreme care to keep the heart firmly anchored to the rib cage by its primary blood vessels, sometimes even wrapping it in protective amulets inscribed with spells from the Book of the Dead that explicitly ordered the heart not to betray its owner during divine questioning. This religious framework created a massive, highly stratified economic apparatus around death that turned embalming into one of the most profitable commercial monopolies in the ancient world. Mummification was not a uniform service offered equally to all citizens. It was an expensive, tiered commodity where your status in the afterlife directly matched your bank account in the physical world. The Greek historian Herodotus recorded that embalming services were offered in 3 distinct price packages. The top-tier elite package, reserved for pharaohs, high priests, and wealthy oligarchs, included the full, brutal nose-hook brain extraction, complete evisceration of the abdominal organs, and 70 days of dehydration in dry natron salt, costing the equivalent of several years of a laborer's wages. For the middle-class merchant or lower bureaucrat who could not afford the labor-intensive brain extraction process, embalmers offered a cheaper, chemical alternative. Instead of hammering spikes up the nose, they injected cedar oil directly into the rectum using animal bladders, plugged up the body's orifices, and buried the corpse in natron for weeks. The caustic cedar oil dissolved the internal organs, including the brain and intestines, turning them into a liquid sludge that simply drained out of the lower body when the plug was removed, delivering a semi-preserved corpse at a fraction of the labor cost. For the destitute working class, who made up the vast majority of the population, mummification was reduced to a swift rinse of the intestines with a cheap purgative and a 30-day dry-out in the desert heat, leaving the brain intact to slowly wither inside the skull. This commercial reality meant that for thousands of years, the thoroughness with which your brain was turned to mush was a direct status symbol of your wealth and social standing. The richer you were, the more violent and comprehensive your post-mortem brain destruction was guaranteed to be. Yet this total dismissal of the brain created a profound paradox within Egyptian medical science itself. While embalmers were treating the brain like garbage, Egyptian field surgeons were simultaneously writing the world's first accurate descriptions of cranial trauma. The Edwin Smith Papyrus, a military medical manual dating back to 1600 BC, contains 48 detailed clinical cases of traumatic injuries, including skull fractures, brain lacerations, and spinal dislocations. The unknown author of the text carefully documented that damage to specific regions of the brain caused loss of speech, localized paralysis on the opposite side of the body, and uncontrollable eye tremors. The text even describes the physical texture of the brain with startling accuracy, comparing the folds of the cerebral cortex to the rippled slag on molten copper. Here lies the ultimate historical irony. Egyptian physicians were fully aware that smashing a man in the head with a bronze battle axe would instantly paralyze his leg or rob him of his ability to speak, proving a direct physical link between the brain and bodily movement. Yet their religious ideology was so deeply entrenched and their commitment to the supreme status of the heart so absolute that this empirical clinical evidence was completely compartmentalized and ignored when it came to the afterlife. They saw the brain's real-time control of the body as a temporary mortal mechanism, a minor hydraulic switchboard that operated the meat suit during life, while the heart retained sole custody of the eternal soul. To the Egyptian mind, a brain fracture was merely a localized plumbing issue in the head, whereas a damaged heart was an existential catastrophe that threatened your very place in the universe. This deliberate blind spot persisted for over 3,000 years, surviving changes in dynasties, foreign invasions, and cultural shifts. Even as Greek scholars like Alcmaeon of Croton and Herophilus began dissecting human bodies in Alexandria during the Ptolemaic period and arguing that the brain was indeed the seat of human intelligence, the traditional embalmers kept right on hammering bronze hooks up the noses of the elite, pulling out brains and dumping them in the sand. They were not interested in scientific updates. They were running a sacred preservation factory designed to defeat physical decay by any means necessary. And the brain was simply too wet, too unstable, and too spiritually useless to survive the journey to eternity. But this obsessive physical destruction of the brain was only the surface symptom of a much deeper, far more terrifying struggle against the natural world. A struggle that forced the Egyptians to invent chemical technologies that would unknowingly preserve their physical lives for 4,000 years. The war against physical decay was not a philosophical exercise for the ancient Egyptians. It was a brutal race against the ambient thermodynamics of the Nile Basin. In a climate where shade temperatures routinely cross 105 degrees Fahrenheit, an untreated human corpse becomes a biological weapon within 48 hours. The rapid accumulation of putrescine and cadaverine, driven by the unchecked proliferation of gut bacteria, causes tissues to liquefy and rupture the abdominal cavity in a matter of days. To the Egyptian elite, this natural process was not merely repulsive, it was a spiritual death sentence. If the physical shell decomposed past the point of recognition, the Ka, the spiritual double that required a physical anchor to receive offerings, and the Ba, the personality that moved between the living world and the tomb, would become permanently homeless. The soul would drift aimlessly in the underworld, deprived of sustenance, effectively suffering a second, irreversible extinction. Mummification was therefore developed not as an art form, but as an aggressive chemical intervention designed to halt the natural carbon cycle, The primary weapon in this chemical war was natron, a naturally occurring sodium carbonate decahydrate compound harvested in massive quantities from the dry lake beds of the Wadi el Natron, northwest of Cairo.
Natron is a violent desiccant, composed of a precise mixture of sodium carbonate, sodium bicarbonate, sodium chloride, and sodium sulfate. It functions by drawing free water out of biological tissue through osmotic pressure, while simultaneously saponifying fats and raising the pH to a level where bacterial enzymes are completely denatured.
The mechanics of this chemical preservation were cold, systematic, and entirely unforgiving. Once the brain was liquefied and extracted through the nasal passages, and the internal organs were removed through a 4-inch incision in the left flank, the embalmers washed the empty body cavity with palm wine and crushed spices to slow microbial growth. They then submerged the entire corpse in hundreds of pounds of dry natron salt for a strict period of 40 days. During this time, the natron absorbed up to 75% of the body's total water weight.
The skin transformed from supple human tissue into a brittle, dark, leather-like parchment, and the overall weight of the corpse plummeted from an average of 150 pounds to under 40. The embalmers then stuffed the hollow abdominal and thoracic cavities with linen, sawdust, resin-soaked straw, and packets of dry natron to restore a lifelike shape, preventing the skin from collapsing into a flat, unrecognizable husk. The skull, now empty of its liquefied brain tissue, was routinely filled with molten coniferous resin or hot beeswax poured directly through the nostrils via a bronze funnel. As the liquid resin cooled inside the cranial vault, it solidified into a hard, sterile mass, completely sealing the interior bone surfaces from moisture, airborne fungal spores, and flesh-eating beetles. This was not a soft or respectful process. It was an industrial manufacturing pipeline designed to convert perishable meat into an inert, highly durable statue made of dried human leather and tree sap. This elaborate chemical procedure was extraordinarily expensive, creating a vast socioeconomic divide in how ancient Egyptians prepared for the afterlife. Mummification was the ultimate cash cow for the priesthood of Anubis, who held a complete monopoly on the trade and structured their services into distinct pricing tiers that mirrored the rigid class hierarchy of the realm. The royal and high aristocratic package, which included full cranial excerebration through the nose, complete abdominal evisceration, custom alabaster canopic jars for the liver, lungs, stomach, and intestines, and hundreds of yards of fine imported linen, cost an astronomical sum, often equivalent to several years of income for a common laborer. For the rising middle class of bureaucrats, overseers, and wealthy merchants who could not afford the elite service, embalmers offered a grim chemical shortcut. Instead of performing time-consuming manual surgery to remove the organs, the embalmers injected cedar oil directly into the deceased person's rectum using bone syringes, quickly plugging the body to prevent the liquid from escaping. Cedar oil contains high concentrations of terpene compounds that aggressively dissolve organic tissue. The corpse was then packed in natron for 40 days, during which the cedar oil systematically liquefied the internal organs inside the body cavity. On the final day of the process, the plug was removed, and the liquefied, dissolved gut mass drained out entirely, leaving behind an empty, desiccated skin shell without ever requiring a single surgical incision. For the vast majority of the Egyptian population, the peasant farmers, laborers, and slaves whose sweat built the kingdom's infrastructure, neither of these options was remotely accessible. The lower classes were subjected to the basic package, a quick purgative wash of the intestines, followed by a shallow burial in the scalding, dry sand of the desert margin outside the fertile floodplain. Yet, in a supreme twist of historical irony, these low-cost desert interments often produced far superior biological preservation than the low-tier chemical mummification methods bought by the middle class. The hot, Hyper-arid sand naturally wicked moisture away from the bodies so rapidly that tissue decay was halted before putrefaction could even begin, creating naturally dried mummies with intact features, intact organs, and fully intact brains that survived for thousands of years. While the wealthy spent small fortunes paying priests to hammer bronze hooks into their heads and dissolve their guts with cedar oil, the destitute peasants were naturally immortalized by the scorching heat of the Saharan sand for free. The commercialization of death was so lucrative that embalming workshops operated like high-volume factories, situated strategically on the west bank of the Nile to facilitate the transport of natron, resins, and wrapped corpses between the river barges and the necropolis tombs. The ultimate destination for all this chemical and physical effort was not the tomb itself, but the court of Osiris in the underworld, specifically the terrifying ordeal known as the weighing of the heart. In the Egyptian cosmos, physical preservation was merely the prerequisite ticket that allowed you to stand trial before 42 divine judges. During this cosmic audit, the heart, the Ib, was placed on one side of a massive golden scale, balanced against the feather of Ma'at, the personification of truth, cosmic order, and justice. If the heart was light, untainted by cowardice, deceit, or grave moral failings, the scale balanced perfectly, and the soul was granted passage to the field of reeds, an idealized, endless paradise that mirrored the fertile Nile Delta, without tax collectors, disease, or crop failures. But if the heart was heavy with sin, the scale tipped instantly. The heart was promptly devoured by Ammit, a terrifying composite demon with the head of a crocodile, the forequarters of a lion, and the hindquarters of a hippopotamus. Being consumed by Ammit meant complete, absolute oblivion, the total destruction of the soul, erasing the individual from the universe forever. Noticeably absent from this cosmic courtroom was the brain. No deity stood by to weigh the cerebral cortex. No demon waited to chew on the frontal lobe. The organ that harbored every thought, strategy, memory, and emotion the deceased had ever experienced in life was left behind in a pile of resinous sludge at the bottom of a desert dumping pit, completely irrelevant to the judgment of eternity. When modern science finally gained the tools to examine ancient Egyptian mummies using non-invasive imaging, the full extent of this ancient anatomical worldview was laid bare. In 1977, researchers performed the first computed tomography, CT scans, on mummies, expecting to find empty skulls or neat resin fills. Instead, they discovered a messy, mechanical history etched into bone. High-resolution scans of thousands of mummies across different dynasties reveal clear physical evidence of the embalmer's bronze hook, jagged, broken ethmoid bones inside the upper nasal cavity, fractured sinus passages, and varying levels of efficiency in the extraction process. In some mummies, the brain was removed with surgical perfection, leaving behind only a smooth coating of dark resin along the back of the skull. In others, particularly from periods of economic instability or political collapse, when embalming standards slipped, large fragments of dried, shriveled brain tissue were left sloshing around inside the cranial cavity, sealed beneath a hasty layer of bitumen. The embalmers did not care about neatness. They cared about throughput. As long as the body looked intact from the outside and met the basic religious criteria, the internal state of the head was secondary. Today, modern neuroscience has completely inverted the ancient Egyptian hierarchy of human biology. We know with absolute certainty that the heart is merely a mechanical muscle pump, a sophisticated four-chambered muscular valve that circulates oxygenated blood through 90,000 miles of vessels. It possesses no thoughts, stores no memories, generates no moral choices, and harbors no spiritual essence. Every single aspect of what makes an individual unique, their personality, their deepest fears, their capacity for mathematics, their love for music, and their moral compass is generated entirely by 86 billion neurons, firing electric pulses across trillions of synaptic connections inside the dark, jelly-like matrix of the brain.
The very organ that the Egyptians smashed, liquefied, and discarded through the nostrils as useless cranial sludge was, in reality, the sole architect of their entire civilization. The brain conceived the geometry of the pyramids, engineered the irrigation canals of the Nile, composed the intricate spells of the Book of the Dead, and invented the complex religious mythology that demanded its own destruction. Yet, despite their complete biological misunderstanding of the brain, the ancient Egyptians achieved their ultimate goal through sheer mechanical obsession. By identifying the high moisture content of the cranial cavity as a primary driver of biological decay and relentlessly removing it, their crude bronze hook surgeries successfully halted the clock of natural decomposition. They threw away the engine of human consciousness to save the skin that housed it. 4,000 years later, we stand in climate-controlled museum halls, staring directly into the withered, dry faces of Ramses the Great, Hatshepsut, and Tutankhamun.
Their hearts are dried husks, their brains were long ago discarded in the desert sand, and their spiritual beliefs were built on a complete inversion of human biology. But as their dry, leather-like remains continue to defy the slow burn of time, one cold, ironic truth remains undeniable. Their bizarre, violent obsession with physical preservation ultimately worked.